When Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, many expected the war to be decided in days. Kiev was supposed to fall. The Ukrainian government was supposed to collapse. The army was supposed to be overwhelmed. On paper, the numbers made sense. Russia had the tanks, the missiles, the aircraft, the manpower, but war is not fought on paper. Within days, Russian columns were stalled. Ukrainian soldiers were striking back, repositioning, communicating, and surviving under pressure in ways that shocked the world. And one of the reasons why began years earlier, not in Washington, not in London, and not on the front page of any newspaper. It began with Canadian soldiers in Ukraine. For 7 years, they trained Ukrainian troops, mentored commanders, and helped transform a force that had been badly shaken in 2014 into something far more capable. Most Canadians never heard much about it, but when the invasion came, the results were impossible to ignore. This is the story of Operation UNIFIER, the Canadian mission that helped prepare Ukraine before the world was watching. If you want to hear more stories like this one, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. What city and country are you in? Now let us go back to 2015, when Canadian soldiers arrived in Ukraine for a mission that looked small at the time, but would later prove far more important than almost anyone understood. It began not in 2022, but in 2014. When Russia illegally annexed the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine, the Ukrainian government faced an army that had been structured, trained, and culturally shaped by decades of Soviet doctrine. Top-down command, rigid hierarchies, soldiers who waited for orders rather than adapted to the moment. Ukraine asked its international partners for help. Canada was among the first to answer. In April 2015, the Canadian Armed Forces announced the deployment of a task force to Western Ukraine. Operation UNIFIER formally began on the 14th of September 2015 at the International Center for Security and Peacekeeping in Starichi. Approximately 200 Canadian soldiers, rotating every 6 months, began training Ukrainian forces in everything from tactical combat medicine to engineering and leadership. The mission was not about sending weapons, it was about transforming how soldiers thought. Canada was also the first nation to provide permanent staff to the Multinational Coordination Cell, the body that coordinated training efforts among partner nations including the United Kingdom, the United States, Lithuania, Poland, and Denmark. By the time the full-scale invasion arrived, Canada had trained more than 33,000 Ukrainian soldiers on Ukrainian soil. The scale of the commitment was significant. The philosophy behind it was more so. The central challenge Canadian trainers encountered was not a lack of courage in the Ukrainian army. It was a cultural inheritance that actively worked against battlefield effectiveness. In the old Soviet command model, a sergeant waited for direction from above. Initiative was not rewarded, it was punished. The entire system depended on centralized decision-making that was slow, rigid, and catastrophically vulnerable whenever communication broke down. Canadian doctrine operated on fundamentally different principles, what Western militaries call mission command. Commanders define the objective. Subordinates determine how to reach it. A section sergeant is expected to make decisions in real time without waiting for approval from officers. Building that culture required more than instruction. It required the Ukrainians to unlearn something deeply embedded. Early rotations of Canadian trainers reported resistance. Soldiers who had fought in the Donbass since 2014 and were skeptical of what a Canadian could teach them about their own war. The Canadians shifted their approach. Rather than teaching from a position of authority, they focused on shared problem solving. The relationship changed. Lieutenant Colonel Melanie Lake commanded Operation UNIFIER through her rotation in 2021. An engineer and veteran of deployments in Afghanistan, Lake took command of the mission as Russian forces were visibly massing on Ukraine's borders. She described the challenge of her role as helping soldiers break the risk aversion that comes from a culture of punishment to empower subordinates and delegate authority. The Ukrainians, she said, were not lacking will. They were learning to trust themselves. Lake was preceded in command by Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Heer, and the handover between them marked the first female-to-female command transfer in a Canadian Armed Forces operation. Within the context of a mission that explicitly trained Ukrainian women serving in combat roles, this continuity of female leadership carried its own meaning. Alongside leadership training, Canadian combat engineers instructed Ukrainian forces on locating and neutralizing explosives. Canadian medical trainers built programs in tactical combat casualty care, the kind of emergency medicine that determines whether a wounded soldier survives the first minutes after being hit. When Russia's full-scale invasion began on the 24th of February, 2022, Canadian personnel in Ukraine withdrew. They returned to Canada and waited. 6 months later, they were back, this time in the United Kingdom, training Ukrainian recruits who weeks earlier had been working in factories, restaurants, and wheat fields. Combat engineers and medical personnel followed in Poland that October. The soldiers trained in the years before the invasion were now the ones holding the line. Senior Sergeant Anatoly Manitsky, who received his first combat engineering course with Canadian instructors in Khmelnytsky in 2015, used those skills near Kyiv in the early weeks of the invasion. Lieutenant Bohdan Gishchuk, trained by Canadian instructors in 2018, was still teaching those same techniques to Ukrainian soldiers at the Khmelnytsky facility in 2025. Multiple Ukrainian soldiers and commanders have stated publicly that training received under Operation UNIFIER, particularly in tactical medicine and decentralized decision-making, directly contributed to saving lives in combat. Canadian trainers who served in Ukraine and watched the invasion from thousands of kilometers away described the experience as deeply personal. They were not watching a conflict on the news. They were watching people they had trained, people they knew by name, fighting a war with the skills they had worked to pass on. The plaques on the walls of the Khmelnytsky training facility still show Canadian and Ukrainian soldiers standing side by side. Operation UNIFIER, now in its 11th year, has trained more than 47,000 members of Ukraine's security forces since 2015. Approximately 13,000 of them since the full-scale invasion began. On the 24th of February 2026, the 4th anniversary of Russia's invasion, the Government of Canada renewed and expanded the operation for an additional 3 years through 2029. The famous 65-kilometer Russian convoy that stalled on the road to Kyiv in the first weeks of the invasion became a symbol of one army's failure of command, a force paralyzed by rigid hierarchy when conditions changed and communication broke down. The Ukrainian units that harassed and dismantled it did not wait for orders from above. They adapted. That is not attributable to Canada alone. Ukrainian soldiers had been fighting in the Donbas since 2014, and their courage was entirely their own. Lieutenant Colonel Lake said it clearly, Canada could not teach courage, and the Ukrainians demonstrated it in full measure. But something had been transferred quietly over 7 years of rotations, classrooms, and training grounds in Western Ukraine. A way of thinking, a doctrine of trust. The understanding that the soldier closest to the problem is often the one best positioned to solve it. Canada was there before the world was watching. It remains there now.